Right, I'm going to move on to the subject of coronavirus. And I just want to make a few points about this. It's really hard to draw too many hard and fast conclusions about what's going on because it's all such a fast-moving feast. However, there has been some conjecture about the validity of the government's response. Some say that it's not severe enough. We need to lock down all the way right now. In fact, last year we should have done it or something. There's others that say it's way over the top and our freedoms are at stake and this is totalitarianism gone mad. People on the right of centre tend to be worried about the freedoms. People on the left of centre tend to be worried about not going far enough with lockdown. And I think that probably reflects the respective confidence that those two sides of politics have in the government as someone who's able to solve problems. But with coronavirus, it's very, very hard actually to know. And I think most of us just don't know. There's lots of unknowns. But let me say what can be reasonably discerned, and it's this. Responding to coronavirus is a question of finding the right balance between competing costs. And when one starts to look, one quickly realises that there is no low-cost solution. Consider this. Consider firstly the cost of virus, illnesses and death. Very, very grave. It's not just the fact that people are dying, it's the fact that there's families involved, it's the fact of humanitarian issues, it's the fact of the health system, it's the fact of an overloaded health system, an overwhelmed health system, and the attendant anarchy and horror that goes along with that. That actually is something with very, very grave implications. You think people can end up dying in corridors, unable to get care and that kind of thing. And with something like a coronavirus, that doesn't take long. Secondly, not just the cost of the deaths, but people have rightly pointed out, well, what's the cost of an economic shutdown? Good point. Of course it's big. We're talking about people's livelihoods, people's incomes, people's families, people's futures. People die in economic depressions. There's mental health, there's violence, there's substance abuse, there's family breakdown, there's all sorts of things. There is definitely a cost. But what about some others? What about the cost of the debt that could be incurred by the government response, or indeed is being incurred by any government response? At last count, and this has probably gone up by now, it was $320 billion to be spent pretty quickly on coronavirus response. That's 16.4% of our GDP in one hit. We're talking about flattening the virus curve. What about the attendant issue of flattening the debt curve? Because that never happened, see. The global financial crisis came along. We had plenty of money. We didn't have any government debt. What happened? We plunged ourselves into debt. In order to spend our way out of that crisis, and there's debate about whether that was effective or not. But what did we do in the good times? Did we start saving? Did we start pinching our pennies? Did we reserve some money so that we might be able to encounter the next tough time well? Did we do what Joseph did in the Old Testament and save up for the famine and get storehouses of what we needed? It seems not. We never got back to surplus. We never dealt with our debt issues. Next crisis comes, what happens? Well, we plunge all the way down further. This cannot go on forever. Who pays it back? It's a generational problem. What happens when you end up getting debt on debt on debt and you find yourself unable to get out of it? Well, your credit rating's at risk. Investment in the country is at risk. Wage growth is at risk. GDP per capita is at risk. You have ongoing serious problems. This is systemic long term. What about the cost of isolation for individuals? You think of people who are dealing with depression and mental health, anxiety, people who need to be out and about in crowds to stop their anxiety issues from getting worse. People who have been recovering from addictions. Nothing worse than putting someone in a room and saying stay there by themselves when they're recovering from addictions. What about the cost of the unknown? Because if we think we know the full implications and ramifications of this, you think of the infinite, complex, multi-level chain reactions that are going on around the world right now. You think that a guy eating an undercooked bat in China could create this whole disaster. We are crazy if we think that we can predict the outcome with any reasonable accuracy. There's the unknown. Now, those are all the bad things, but there's opportunities as well. Being at home, families are together. In most cases, that's a very, very good thing. A very good thing. Busy people are resting, and they might not like resting, but probably they've been too busy for too long for, sometimes wrong reasons, and forced to stop. That's not necessarily a bad thing at all. It brings what's most important into life into stark relief. God. How about that? It brings the frailty of life into stark relief. It makes people think and take time. And you know what? If people think on God, well, that's worth it. Relationships, loved ones, families. And we also forget that people are resilient and flexible. We sometimes fall for this notion that everyone's a wilting wallflower and we need to be protected and cared for to the nth degree. People are tough. People adapt. People change. People deal with circumstance. This isn't all bad, but here's the thing. Which is the low-cost answer? There's not one. Which is the right way to go? Well, I think policymakers need the wisdom of Solomon to know how to plot a path that walks between these competing costs and some benefits and tries to develop an outcome that's unpredictable, but nonetheless minimizes cost. And they may adapt as data comes to light, and that should be fine. They should be able to do that, and we shouldn't think any the worse of them. But the response we have is built very strongly around the idea that the health system could be overloaded. And I think that that's reasonable. Professor Brendan Murphy, the most important thing we have been looking at in this health system capacity modelling has been what is our intensive care unit bed capacity and what is our intensive care unit bed demand. We've already planned to triple our intensive care unit bed capacity, and we ought to make sure that we can have the tools to manage the growth of COVID-19 within that capacity. This is a serious issue. We've got 2,229 intensive care beds, roughly 900 New South Wales, 900 split between Victoria, Queensland, the rest scattered around in smaller numbers. This is something that's got to be managed, and it's the whole flattening the curve thing. New York State, they're currently trying to build 87,000 more hospital beds, 37,000 more ICU beds, hospitals being expanded. Emergency field hospitals been set up in Central Park. Hospital ship USS Comfort with 1,000 beds is moored off Manhattan. Temporary hospitals been built within the convention centre and so on. And they can't get the PPE, they can't get the equipment to make it happen. They're passing laws to allow one ventilator or respirator to be used between two patients. They need 30,000 new ventilators urgently. They've only sourced 7,400. In the entire country, they've got between 100 and 170,000 ventilators. They think they could need 960,000. 341 temporary field hospitals are under construction. Parts of the USA need 800% more beds. 15 military bases have been approved as quarantine camps. The overloading of the health system really has implications that, if we just spend some time thinking about them, are very, very grave and very, very serious. And a lot of the concern here is around making sure that the health system can cope whilst trying to achieve that within the least cost intensive way in those other areas that I outlined. But I think that that's fair enough. We have to say that the government's relied on modelling and is exercising its best wisdom. But two concerns which I might have is this. Firstly, people who make rules really need to ensure that they have the respect of those who they want to follow the rules. And there's, been all sorts of things done with over-enforcement, overzealousness, fines being dished out for silly, silly things that are not risky. And I think people who exist in highly bureaucratic environments need to understand that enforcing rules for rules' sake, divorced from logic, divorced from humanity, divorced from common sense and purpose, just makes them look like power trippers. It undermines the trust and respect that the public have for them, and it's that trust and respect that's vital if this thing is to be sustained for a long time. They need to fine people and enforce these rules against those who are actually being risky. Not people who are going out for a drive with the doors closed and never getting out of the car. Not someone who's having a learning driving lesson with their own mum. Not, this kind of silly stuff. And not coming out and saying, well, romantic couples can't see each other. I just think that's one. The longevity of this is at stake if that is not curbed. That's the first thing. And longevity is actually important in all of this because it's got to be sustained and be sustainable. And the second thing is this. I think if we have a risk in getting the calibration wrong in trying to walk through these competing costs, the risk would be that we would have too much trust in the government to save us from the consequences of the situation. And I think if we think that consequences are that simple, that the government can pick them all and save us from them all, then we're very naive. I also think that I've lost my spot. I also think that government intervention itself. That's right. If we really think that government intervention itself does not come with consequences, and indeed very unpredictable consequences, and I talked about some of the clear ones like debt, etc., and the intergenerational aspects of that and the challenges that creates, then we're also naive. And so there's a caution there that the government can't save us from anything, and I trust that we don't fall into that caution. But my basic answer to this at the moment is, I'm glad I'm not making the decisions. Pray that these policymakers have the wisdom of Solomon Realize that what they're doing is not outside the ballpark of reasonable, and let's trust that we're led through this and led through it well. Hey guys, make sure you click like to like the video, or hit the subscribe button down here and click on the bell so you don't miss any notifications. And to watch more videos, just click here. Cheers. Go on, click one. You know you want to.